Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual event on the topic of AI standards, ethical considerations, and best practices when implementing AI in your organization. This event is sponsored by IEEE Educational Activities and the IEEE Standards Association. My name is Jennifer McLean. I'm Senior Manager of Education Products with IEEE Educational Activities, and I will be helping to moderate today's event. IEEE is the world's largest technical professional organization dedicated to advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. Please note a few housekeeping items before we get started. At the bottom of your screen are engagement tools that are resizable and movable, so you can move them around to make the most out of your dashboard space. If you have questions for today's panelists, you can submit them through the Q&A widget on your screen or click the purple Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer as many questions as time allows. To receive a certificate of participation for this event, remember to click the certificate icon at the bottom of your screen. And finally, the on-demand link for today's presentation will be emailed to all registrants approximately 2 hours after we finish. Our presenters today are Nell Watson and Matt Silveira. Nell is a world-renowned futurist thinker known for bridging the world of technology and humanity. She is a member of numerous societies and organizations and has been awarded several fellowships and several esteemed organizations. She is a senior member of IEEE. And Matt is the chair of the IEEE P7000 Standards Working Group and serves on P7004 and P7005 as a working group member. He has served as adjunct faculty at the University of California Extension in Davis, at the California State University of Extension in Sacramento, and at the Los Rios Community College District. I welcome you both, and I'll now turn it over to Nell to get us started.
Hello, everyone. We live in some very fast-moving times, times which are exciting and also a little bit scary. Those tech companies have managed to consolidate a lot of power in a short range of time. These tech companies had experience working with very clever algorithms. They had a lot of brilliant engineers, and they were sitting on lots of data. And of course, as we know, data is kind of like the gasoline of machine learning. Data enables machine learning to understand the world, to make predictions, and to interpret things for us. Artificial intelligence and similar algorithmic technologies offer tremendous benefits for humanity. They can help us to optimize for chaotic and difficult situations. They can help us to find new solutions that we otherwise could not, perhaps even helping us to invent new products or new ways of thinking about the world. However, if we are to enjoy these very powerful new technologies, we need to do so in a way which is safer, which is more trustworthy, which the public can respect and can feel as if they are involved in. There also needs to be a concordance between technology and governance so that both of them can work in concert. For this to happen, there needs to be transparency. Transparency is in many ways the foundation of good ethics. They say that sunlight is the greatest disinfectant, and it's by seeing into systems and seeing into organizations that we can know what is going on and thereby be able to start to work out whether a system might be biased or which elements in an organization may bear responsibility for a situation. One other very important aspect of our world today is the fact that there are so many different jurisdictions. Those jurisdictions may be geographical, they may be political. Within each of those territories, different rules apply. And to some degree, this is creating a kind of a fragmentation. It is, to a degree, more difficult now to deploy these kinds of technologies, and it's becoming more of a challenge all the time, as different nations or different geographies in the world bring out tough new rules of how these technologies are to be used. And that creates an extra layer of overhead which needs to be accounted for when it comes to bringing new products to market, particularly products which are in sensitive areas or which are embedded within mission-critical infrastructure. There's also potential, of course, for flags of convenience, shopping around for the most ideal place to do some sort of activity where people tend to look away and enable people to get on with things without too much oversight. And I think it's important that we work together as an international community in order to bring everyone in the world up to at least a baseline of safety and tolerances that we can all respect. One other aspect, of course, of this internationalization of these technologies is different culture. We mustn't permit a monopolization of what culture gets loaded into machines. It's very important that we find ways to teach machines about our culture, to teach machines about what is appropriate or what is not appropriate in a given situation or a given cultural context. If we can get that right, then we can enable machines to meet us where we are, to fit into our social circles, and to be able to understand why we took an action or did not. For the last 5 years or so, I've been working on a number of projects with the IEEE related to the ethics of AI and autonomous systems, including the P7000 series of standards and the ECPAS, ECPAIS, certifications in ethics. There are several important aspects of these. One observation we made is that it's often important to think about systems not in isolation, but considering the environment in which they were created, in which they were designed and deployed, because environment drives behavior. I liken it to a plane crash, and you're trying to figure out what happened. And there are, of course, two recorders. There is the recorder of flight data of the machine itself, but there is also a cockpit voice recorder, which tells you what was going on in the cockpit and probably what was going on in the minds of the pilots at the time. Because, of course, sometimes things can go wrong with piloting, sometimes things can go wrong with the machine, and often it's some interaction between the two. And so by looking at things in terms of systems and organizations, we can better understand how things might go wrong, or ideally, how we can help to make things safer and to align incentives in new ways. It's important also to realize that ethics is not a solvable problem. It will never be perfect, but perfect is sometimes the enemy of better. We can indeed strive to do better, and we can reach that. And through iteration, we can get better and better. Just as, to expand the analogy, just as airline safety has done these past several decades and continues to do so into the future. So let's take a look at some of the areas in which these standards and certifications, which we have created and are creating at the IEEE, what areas they go into and what kind of domains they cover. I briefly mentioned transparency before and its importance, because transparency is in many ways a prerequisite for other forms of ethical safety and compliance. It's important that we are able to gain oversight into machines, to understand not only what happened in the past, but what is going on right at this moment, or indeed what might happen in the near future. Good transparency helps us to understand how to disclose what information to whom and in what manner. For example, somebody might have a disability, or they might be in an inconvenient situation, or it might be a very personal matter. And this will help to influence how a disclosure of information should be made to a user, or indeed to a member of the public, or perhaps to an auditor, someone who is specialized in working out what happened with the machine. It's also important that we communicate the purpose of a device. Why does it exist? Who owns it? And how did it come to be deployed in a certain area? And these are difficult questions, particularly when these kinds of devices may be deployed in public settings, for example, by police, who may be doing things like facial recognition. We've worked hard to come up with solid criteria for how these kinds of issues should be handled. Accountability is really another way of saying responsibility, but responsibility which is tagged to a certain person or a certain function or a certain role or a certain organization. It's about understanding what went wrong, for what reason, and indeed how to put it right. Accountability is also about understanding incentives, to understand what kinds of structures within organizations might tend to drive a certain behavior or to inhibit a certain behavior. For example, an organization which is very secretive about its intellectual property, that might, for example, make transparency more difficult. A hot topic these days, and will continue to be for a long time, is the mitigation of bias. It is very difficult to remove all bias from systems. And indeed, bias means different things to a statistician or a sociologist. As difficult as it may be, it is certainly possible to reduce bias and to evolve through different processes that can help us to understand where bias may be and to begin to offset it or reduce its influence within the system. It's important to understand where biases may come in, whether that's from data, whether that's from how a user interacts with the machine, or indeed the environment in which that system has been deployed. We can undertake auditing to better understand how a system functions and where things could potentially go wrong or where they could be improved. And one aspect of this that's so important is explainability. Being able to provide a plain language explanation of why a system undertook a certain action or why it made a certain prediction about someone. And in fact, legislators all around the world are now increasingly stating that systems must be able to share that kind of information with people to enable people not only to understand that a system has made an impression about them, but in fact what that impression was and the roots or the predicates upon which that impression has been made. This is incredibly important when it comes to famous cases like with the Horizon system, which put dozens or possibly even hundreds of postmasters in the United Kingdom in jail. Some of those postmasters were pregnant. Some of them ended up suiciding. And it was all due to bias which was built into this system, which wasn't accounted for and which no one had properly audited. So this is a tragic example of just how important these systems are. And as these technologies become more widespread and more deeply embedded in our personal and professional lives, there's ever greater opportunity for things to go wrong. And that's why we need to work to ensure that things go more rightly. One way of potentially preventing biases is privacy. If there is less personal and intimate information about people known, then by and large, it's harder to be biased against an individual. It's not just about keeping things secret. Really, we see it more as an issue of dignity. For example, you might be listening to a music streaming service, and you might reasonably suppose that that streaming service might sell your data to somebody who's putting on a concert, right? Music, right? Music is the category of that service. And you might reasonably be expected that a concert or a new album might show up in your adverts. But you might not expect a system to observe that you're listening to breakup songs and some algorithm to decide that that's a good time to sell you high-proof alcohol. That would not be a dignified use of your information. And the lack of dignity in the use of your personal data would potentially constitute a privacy violation. So privacy is perhaps a slightly broader domain than we often think about it. Generally speaking, data minimization is a good principle. If you don't need to collect data on someone's activities, etc., if it doesn't have a specified purpose, if it's not making somebody's experience genuinely better, on balance, it is probably better not to collect that information at all. Particularly in a world where our pipelines of data often end up somewhere else, right? We have a data exhaust, and that data can end up being passed like a parcel between a dozen different organizations, all of them making some impression or other about an individual. Then we come to manipulation or obfuscation and disenfranchisement. One of the amazing things about machine intelligence is its ability to generate things, particularly technologies using generative adversarial networks like that, which can basically invent incredibly realistic faces or teddy bears or bowls of soup. Anything you can imagine can be deep faked, right? Including human conversations. There have been incidents where members of parliament have believed they've been talking to one individual when in fact they were talking to another who was using the voice and image of that person to falsely present themselves as that person. There are many opportunities for AI to catfish us or to cause us to doubt reality, perhaps even to gaslight us so we're not quite sure what to believe anymore. This is a very undignified and inhumane use of these kinds of technologies. It's okay when it's for entertainment, if everybody knows it's for entertainment. But it's easy for these technologies to have multiple purposes, which can be used in ways that people don't expect. It's also important that we don't find ways to exclude people, that we don't put them in a glass box where they think they can see the world around them, that they can interact with their peers, but in fact, maybe their postings fall on deaf ears, they're downvoted, or maybe the people that they're talking to, who they think are their peers, might in fact be bots. They might be excluded in ways which are wholly non-transparent. And we've come up with some rules that we think hopefully can prevent these kinds of uses of the technology, which we find particularly problematic. So I think that's the end of my piece today. I'd just like to leave you with 3 questions. The first is essentially, how could the processes within your organization or within the systems that you deploy, how could they be made more simple? How could they be made more explainable? How could you better involve people in understanding how those systems function so that they can better participate, they can better query what's going on, and they can generally be empowered to understand how these technologies function. This is particularly important in a world where we've all gone online, and yet many of us are digital immigrants, right? We were dragged kicking and screaming, perhaps, towards technology, and it's not necessarily something that we would immediately reach out to solve a problem. Second question is, what kind of processes or incentives could be manipulated or could be taken in a direction that leads to an unexpected outcome? This is kind of a philosophical question, but it's something I believe is very important when we think about ethics within organizations. And finally, what kinds of processes could be obfuscated? Are there ways in which a technology could be used for other purposes? Maybe not even by your organization or by your team, but perhaps somebody else could use some of that downstream data in ways that weren't expected for. And it's still important to protect your clients, not only from activities in your organization, but also potentially other organizations too. So I hope that you'll give these ideas a bit of a think on over the coming days. And thank you so much for your attention. Now I'd like to hand you off to Matt Silveira, who will take us through the process of establishing AI standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nell. Welcome, everybody. And thank you, Nell, for an outstanding introduction to the entire domain. And I think Nell has done a great job of fundamentally answering the domain question of the why. And when I like to think about how technologists and researchers approach a problem, we're all hungry for the why. I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction now, because I think as technologists and researchers, we're often confronted with a different set of interrogatives, which are the what. What do I have to deliver? And the when. When is it due? In fact, I started my morning early and ended my evening late the other night working on a series of Jira stories that were centered in a software development program I'm working on, where there was a lot of concern around building out the functional capabilities of a emerging 5G application for mobile wireless that I've been working on with a team. And as we started to go into the process, even though we had governance and structure and some roles, it soon became painfully obvious that the focus really on the technology was centered on what are commonly referred to in the privacy and security space as the object, the thing, the machine. And the subject, or the person wasn't centered. And that was a problem. And it was a bigger problem because now I found myself in the role of explaining the why and the impacts to the what, the deliverable, and then potentially the impacts downstream of our timeline. Because as Nell pointed out earlier, if we don't consider the full circle of use cases and how those potential impacts play out, we'll often end up with a product that we're going to have to rework, or worst case, is going to be rejected by the user. And nobody wants that, right? So some of the things we're going to talk about in the next few slides really center on how we can confront these other interrogatives, identify who is important to communicate with, when and how to do that, and more appropriately, communicating the why, not just as merely a technical deliverable, but as a more viable and more feature-rich conversation around the interplay of people and technology. Because we think that not only is that a satisfying process, but it's going to give you, the practitioner, some additional capabilities to extend your experience and extend your profile and career path within your organization. So let's talk about some of these at a high level. We've established governance, understanding our organizational structure, and most oftentimes technologists tend to kind of shrug that off. But it's going to be critical that we, at the very least, understand who our stakeholders are, so that when the opportunity presents itself, we can educate upward to our leadership. It's also critical to understand that we operate in many scenarios today in a matrixed environment. We may be working as a team of teams with folks all across the world, working in different organizations in different countries, and understanding how to best harness that so that we can be effective in communicating that vision in a cohesive way. It's also important to understand the roles in which your product and service sets are operating. While you're certainly going to have folks on your team that are specialists in the GDPR, for example, it's important to also understand at some native ability how that might impact your own deliverables. And then ultimately, establishing processes that are proper, that give adequate explanation and transparency, and more importantly, and this goes back to a key concept that Nell pointed out in terms of a data supply chain, if you will, understanding how all that interacts. Okay. When we think about this, it tends to be overwhelming. I'm sure a lot of us are working not just on one program or project, but on several. And of course, the other challenge is getting our leadership enrolled in our idea or our message. How do we win them over? They often have different competing priorities. And so one way to do this in a small but highly effective way is to establish a pilot or lighthouse project to demonstrate in a tangible and visual way your concerns or the capabilities that you think are important to enhance a subject's privacy capabilities. Some other key areas that we explore are understanding that, to Nell's point about the enemy of perfection is good enough, is progressively elaborating on an idea and socializing that and getting other people to help contribute to that idea. It not only makes for a better outcome, but it also helps relieve some of the individual team members' stress to feel as though they're compelled to deliver that, and it's all on their shoulders to do so, and their single burden. The other thing that's important to appreciate is understanding how your own life cycle works to enhance the delivery of privacy capabilities and controls. More often than not, and I'm sure this is going to sound very familiar to folks, security and privacy is often left as part of a backlog. We say, oh, the next release, we'll get to it. Trust us. But I think it's important to understand how to select the appropriate foundations to then allow the team to process the backlog in a manner that gets the capability to where it needs to be and that is appropriate. And then last but not least, it's critical, if you're not doing it, to conduct lessons learned and not do them simply as a tabletop exercise. But I would urge everybody to consider a 360-degree perspective, if you will, where you're actually going to interview some of the consumers and users of your platforms and get their perspective, and then mine that information and put it back into the product capabilities. So once you have all this put into motion, what's important? It's important to make sure that you have continuity. Certainly everybody wants to advance and eventually move on from one organization and face a new organization's challenges and commitments as part of their own growth. But ensuring that you've established continuity and work with your leadership and your team members to have that model maintained is critical. It's also critical to understand when you're developing that succession model, what other emerging topics are going to come out. As Nell rightly pointed out, ethics isn't a problem to be solved, but it's a problem that's going to have to be continually grappled with. And we have to make sure as practitioners that we're, in our succession model, not just focusing on a person to replace our role, but focusing on a roadmap and how we're going to map in new requirements, new technologies. Because, as Nell pointed out at her introduction, we're in almost a kaleidoscopically changing environment. We have to make sure that we have those capabilities mapped into our plan. And more importantly, we can't make the system process bound to the point that it could be gamed or become stale. I've worked in a number of organizations where we have privacy impact assessments and security assessments, and the answer is always, oh, I have that under control. I know what boxes to check. The minute I hear something like that, it perks my ears, because I know that I'm going to have to pay attention to somebody rationalizing why their particular solution meets the controls, even though on face value, there are obvious gaps and concerns. We want to make sure that everybody around the table feels comfortable bringing up business concepts and topics and use cases. But we want to understand how to do that in a way that's enriching to the organization and provides learning value and opportunities, so that as we're bringing up new team members through the organization and they're transitioning from junior roles to senior roles, they adopt rather than reject the process and strive to make the process effective and as straightforward and simple as possible. So how do we do this in a way that makes sense in terms of courses? And I'm going to introduce this a little bit and then turn it back over to Nell for detail around her course material. When we thought about this, we wanted to make sure that we incorporated both the overall domain, because we're all coming at this from different industries, different perspectives, different experience sets, and different roles within our organization. So we made sure that when we did this, we focused on areas equally, such as healthcare and manufacturing and transportation. So to make sure that I'm following my own guidance, I asked why. Why did we want to do that? It's not obvious that manufacturing has a privacy issue, but in fact, it does. I'll point out a small one that I learned a little while back. I was working on a project where a corporation wanted to market designer denim, and they intended to, this was prior to COVID, market them in large department stores. And so they contracted with a manufacturer in the United States called Avery Dennison to embed a textile RFID tag in the designer denim. These were jeans that were, well, I don't know, $1,500 to $2,000 a pair, out of my price range. Anyway, the concept was that not only could the jeans be worn around the store and then purchased via the RFID tag, but that they could track their customers visiting in and out of their stores and measure what other areas and locations and preferences they had. So I asked the obvious question, how do we inform and notify the customer? To which I was greeted with a bunch of puzzled faces. Well, why not? Why would they want to know? Well, obviously, that's a topic that we're going to be covering in terms of concepts around informed consent, but certainly that's one area where even in the manufacturing process, we might have some sensitivities related to privacy. So Nell, would you like to go out and help me describe some of the other course material here, please, for a moment?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I think the courses, as I see them, distill a lot of the knowledge which has been rapid prototyped and put into the standards and certifications. It kind of it puts it into a form which can be readily digested in quite a short period of time, and which covers so many different aspects, whether it's privacy or data ecosystems and associated pipelines, and of course, transparency and other best practices. I'm quite proud of what we've put together, and I think that it serves as a convenient and concise primer in not only why these issues are so important, but also the steps we can take today in order to help to put things in better shape for the future.
Thank you. Okay. So here are some of the course highlights that you'll find when you're evaluating the courses and selecting some that are at your interest level. First, they're designed for a technical and non-technical audience. So to be more specific, we know that there are a lot of key stakeholders in the privacy space, as Nell and I have described it. Perhaps your legal team might have some interests around how controls work and how to evaluate controls. This course material is designed to be approachable for non-technical folks like your leadership teams and potentially other areas like your legal or compliance teams. I can't overemphasize enough that the course material is human-centric. It's focused on an area that we're all learning about, and some of us may not have a whole lot of exposure to, but we carefully navigate you through the process in a way that will instill some confidence and give you some very practical hand-holding tools so that you can advance conversations that you think are critical going forward. And more significantly, we did not develop these in a vacuum. The IEEE has a proud legacy of building and elaborating and enhancing standards that are adopted worldwide. So when we worked in a very constructive but very deliberate process that's now, at least for P7002 and 7005, taken almost 3 years, we built these understanding that they had to be cooperative and complementary to standards like GDPR and ISO. So we think that from a practical perspective of adoption, you'll find that your team will have the ability to understand them and adopt them quickly. Okay. So finally, we have some links here that will help you further your journey on how to implement responsible AI systems. There's access available for your team and organization, as well as individual access. And Nell and I would encourage you to visit both links and feel free to socialize those with your teams.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Nell. We have lots of great questions, and so I'll get us started with a more general one. Matt, if folks are interested in participating in the standards in development, is there a way for them to get involved?
Absolutely. First, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'll offer that invitation up, and for the uninitiated, sometimes a friendly email or a friendly hand to point to the right place is very effective. Also, if you use your favorite search engine and you search for IEEE PAR for PAR standards, you'll find a host of standards that are available to not only join the work groups, which is an activity that anybody can do. You do not need to be an IEEE member. And once you decide to take the next step and become an IEEE member, you can participate in voting and commenting on those standards. And I can assure you that that everybody I've met is incredibly intelligent, and they're incredibly gracious, and they are collaborative. And so I'm sure everybody on this session is a brilliant person. You'll leave that session smarter and brighter. So I would encourage everybody to look at those. I would also encourage you to look at the IEEE website itself and the IEEE standards website. They're two different sites, but both have a lot of rich information. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much. Nell, we have a question and a comment. Outstanding thinking. One question. In your mind, can we accomplish these goals through just improving or additions to our processes, or do we need to totally rethink and gain commitments for new models and processes?
That's a wonderful question. In an ideal world, we would embrace these new ways of thinking. Ethical elements would be embedded into every piece of the life cycle. And I think that it's rather difficult to have a product which is already designed or already deployed and then try to retrofit it to be more ethically trustworthy or less liable for things to go wrong. It's much easier if you embed those things right from the beginning. And I think in the near future, we will start to design AI products in new ways. And this new generation of products will be much more comprehensively safe and trustworthy. And I think that's the point where AI begins to move out of labs and out of skunkworks and prototypes and really into the mainstream. It's a little bit like SSL or TLS, the little padlock in your browser, right? And whenever you go and look at your online banking, you will see that little padlock. And if you don't see it, you should be surprised and a little bit concerned, because that little padlock, of course, means that your connection is encrypted. And for a long time on the World Wide Web, we didn't have that. And so doing things like online banking or preserving our privacy was very difficult. Once we created those technologies, then it became so much easier to have trust for others. And with lower costs of trust came cheaper coordination. And that has made all the difference. And so I think that we're going to see a similar process with AI in the coming years as these new methods of making AI safer begin to be embedded right from day one.
Thank you very much. We have another question. In terms of AIs and programs making biased assumptions about users, which are made on the premise of economics, class, culture, location, et cetera, is it based on what the program is able to access about the user through privacy agreements?
Well, privacy agreements certainly are an important factor. Generally speaking, of course, very few people actually read those documents. And I think that new regulation coming out is going to mandate that those documents are shorter, are brief, ideally are pictorial. You know, why not have your terms and conditions as a comic book or as a little animation or something like that, which is so much easier for people to digest, right? And of course, we want to make sure that those can be easily translated into people's first language so that they can understand them more easily and more clearly. I think also that we're going to see more granular selection of privacy. So you might be asked to opt in to an email list where they will give you product updates, but they also might ask you to opt in for marketing, right? And you can kind of select either or both of those options. And I think we're going to see more things like that, more granular selection of different options that people can choose to enable the unlocking of some service or other based upon how they have selected that. So basically by selecting that you opt in, some function therefore on the back end can be unlocked to make use of that data that you shared directly.
Thanks, Nell. Another question. are there particular functions within an organization you see as being best positioned to ensure accountability is present within the processes and policies and standards being followed, internal parentheses, internal audit or risk management?
One of the
Nell, do you mind if I
practices.
take that one?
Oh, go ahead, please.
So I think from a best practice perspective, it's important to understand that governance shouldn't fall solely to one tower or silo within an organization. More often than not today, that either falls within a governance and compliance unit or the legal team within an organizational structure. And unfortunately, the results, I think, are something that Nell just mentioned in a previous response. You end up with a rather stilted all or nothing, where you're accepting a banner or accepting a pre-wrappered privacy statement, which sometimes is skipped over, sometimes is used like a jail key to get out of and get access to the app. I think it's more critical that we, as the practitioners, insist that there be a roundtable approach where the developers, the technologists, the leadership team, the marketing team, legal and compliance join together to develop structure to provide those guardrails and those feature sets for the product. Otherwise, you can end up with results that are either going to require some expensive and painful rework, or as Nell pointed out in another answer, you're going to end up with something that the users are going to find awkward and may reject. Anything you'd like to add there, Nell?
Absolutely. I completely concur with what you've said. I'd just very briefly also say that one best practice, I think, that might be helpful, might be quite quickly implementable as well, is for someone high in the organization, somewhere in the C-suite or towards the C-suite, who is an immediate channel through which anyone in the organization can report an ethical concern, right, or a safety concern. Somebody spots something that they think isn't being done in a healthy way or could be done in a lot better way, there should be that channel that they can take that right up to the heads of the organization, rather than having to go through middle management first. I think having that kind of red telephone right to the leaders of the venture is generally going to be a good thing.
Thank you both. Here's a question from John Havens, our friend John Havens. He says, thanks to you, Matt and Nell, for this extremely helpful presentation. My question is it's related to what you were just talking about. What are the top ways you can get buy-in from organizations to implement responsible environments? Meaning, do you go to the HR team or CSR or marketing? Where do you start?
I would say that it starts with the vision of the product or service that you're considering. And at that point, when you're determining, hey, I've got this idea, or we have this idea, we start immediately socializing that. And we bring in those subject matter experts, and we start with a broad group so that everybody's informed. And then, as it's appropriate, folks can elect to participate, or we might suggest that they be, as Nell pointed out in her presentation, they be accountable. Sometimes in organizations, the accountability word scares people. It's a fully loaded word, kind of like a stick of dynamite. I think it's important to fuse that and understand what accountability means, that the entire team supports the accountability process, but more significantly, we get the right people identified as being accountable. Sometimes that might be HR, sometimes that might be legal, sometimes that might be the technical team or the software developers, but establishing that process up front is a way to ensure full outcomes at each stage that you're going through your development and go-to-market strategy.
I would completely agree with that. I think ethical advocates can be found at any level in any department and should be. And I agree also completely that accountability should be peer-to-peer. It should be kind of a buddy system, you know? If you see something, say something, have a quiet word. It doesn't have to be a big, serious thing. It doesn't have to be even a formal process, but that everybody should feel as if they have the power to make a good faith question about something, and to seek more information about a process as well.
Thank you. Next question for Nell. AI has become very important and useful. The lack of ethical regulations can make it very tricky for these valuable systems to be used for the wrong purposes. Do you think that AI can be unsafe itself, or is it dependent on how and by whom it's used?
I would say that all technologies, largely anyway, are value neutral. We can use a blade as a weapon to harm someone, or we can use it as a scalpel to heal someone. Really, it's about the intention behind that use and whether or not that technology is used in a coercive way or in a fraudulent way, right, or manipulative way. And I think that, generally speaking, if we can remove coercion or manipulation from the equation as far as possible, on balance, technology is more likely to be used for good. But I agree, it is very much dependent on the people behind the technology and their intentions as well.
Thanks, Nell. Matt, greetings. This is quite an awesome presentation. Just curious, what are your prospects for AI in the medical field?
That's a great question. The prospects for AI in the medical field are, it's here. Certainly from even consumer devices like Apple's Watch to very advanced devices like dissolvable sensors that can be implanted on someone's skin, we're seeing AI explode in the space. And certainly it brings up privacy concerns, not merely from the casual inspection perspective of saying, well, yeah, I can realize that the Apple Watch is telegraphing data, or that the sensor on my skin could be used for unwholesome or nefarious purposes other than just providing some type of palliative care, but more from the perspective of taking on significant decisions. In fact, here in Northern California, I was party to an organization that was using AI for replacement of trained radiologists for breast cancer detection markers. Certainly, when I read it and was first involved with the project, it gave me some pause. because understanding how AI algorithms work and understanding conversations I've had with radiologists, I thought the goals were going to be orthogonal. But what I found and what we urged as part of the go forward process was a pairing, not unlike the buddy system that Nell described, a pairing between the AI interface and the radiologist, which actually empowered the radiologist to become a better decision maker, because the more mundane sorting tasks were left to the tool, which gave the expert more time to deliberate on some specifically more complicated samples or studies. I think that's a good outcome. Conversely, there are lots of bad ones, especially when we're looking at timelines, going back to the points I was making about the when and the what and the why and the how, and trying to say, well, I want to engage in some data minimization. Oh, that's going to take too much time. Oh, what data do we not want? In the healthcare space, because it's heavily regulated and heavily controlled, and because all the data that's typically being collected is extraordinarily meaningful from a clinical perspective, those types of decisions take time. And I think that when we try to rush that or artificially constrain it or set arbitrary boundaries around it, that's when we run into trouble with AI in the medical space.
I completely agree with that. I would say that AI in health and medical is especially sensitive and especially critical, not only because it may be a matter of life and death, but also that areas in which something might be considered a protected characteristic in another domain, like ethnicity or whether someone might be transgender, in a medical context, those kinds of protected characteristics might be very important for that person's medical care. And so much extra scrutiny is required, and it's a lot more complicated. But it doesn't mean that AI in medical is going to be scuppered. It just means, as always within the medical context, there's a lot more work and a lot more regulations to be satisfied.
Thank you, Nell, and thank you, Matt. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our event now, and so I'd like to thank you both so much for your time, for the great presentation and discussion, and thank you to everybody who attended today. We have now come to the end, like I said, and we will be sending out the on-demand link to this event to everybody who's registered in about 2 hours from now. And before you leave, if you could please complete our feedback survey via the survey tool at the bottom of your screen, we would really appreciate it. And thank you all once again for participating today. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.